The next speaker is Mr. Nick Dagan of Canada, and he is going to discuss seemingly random crisis, the Mars retrograde phase in history. Mr. Nick, please join us here.
Seriously? No applause? Really? That's how we start? Really? Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to say that before starting, that although I am a Western astrologer who uses the tropical zodiac in my own work, the material I'm presenting today is not dependent on any zodiac system. What I'm doing here is essentially an ancient Babylonian style of astrological observation, the study of a planet synodic cycle relative to the sun, whereby historical patterns emerge alongside patterns made by planetary transits. This base of planetary knowledge can be seen as a sort of delta from which the two rivers of our respective astrological cultures have flowed in their own directions. Although I do work as a consulting astrologer, my primary astrological passion is the study of history and the subject of politics and the arts. Astrology is, in its essence, a calendar system, one that assigns a unique value to every moment in time, moment to moment, day to day, year to year, century to century, millennium to millennium. No planetary arrangement is ever arranged in quite the same way. Every planet has its own unique rhythm and time, taking a specific amount of time to make its transit through the 12 signs of either zodiac. I didn't say next slide, please, but now I'm on the slide I should be on. What does Mars retrograde mean? When a planet's orbit brings it closest to Earth, from a geocentric perspective, this planet appears to slow down, then stop, then begin moving forward, then begin moving backwards for about 3 months, then slow down, stop again, and proceed to move forward. One outcome, next slide please. Thank you. One outcome of this phenomenon is simply that Mars will remain in one sign of either zodiac for about half a year. The other outcome is that the planets' change in apparent speed during the successive phases of the retrograde reflect an intensification of its astrological impact in the world. Next slide. Yes. Mars stations retrograde approximately every 26 months. The retrograde period lasts approximately 3 months. Mars consistently has a retrograde transit through the sidereal signs of Gemini, Cancer, and Leo every 15 to 17 years. However, retrogrades in the other signs are considerably more rare, with intervals as large as 47 years between them in the sidereal signs of Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. Okay, for some reason you're going ahead of me in the slides. I don't know if that's my fault or not, but next slide, please. This is Paul McCartney. Next slide, please. Yes, this is what I want. This is probably someone familiar to you. This is Paul McCartney, former member of the Beatles. Maybe you remember She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyway, it's a good little song. But what I'm talking about today is not about rock stars or rock music. I'm just talking about a person who had a mother, a person who had a wife, a person who has children. And I want to show, illustrate a sort of astrological pattern using just the Mars retrograde that tells us a little story about Mr. McCartney's family heritage in an astrological context. Paul McCartney has a striking relationship with the Mars retrograde phase through the sidereal signs of Aquarius and Pisces. McCartney, born on June 18, 1942, probably at 2 p.m. in Liverpool, England, has natal Mars in sidereal Cancer, and the closest aspect is a sextile from Saturn in sidereal Taurus. Although Mars is not his chart ruler in any zodiac system, its retrograde cycle clearly corresponds to many of the most important events and people in his life. Despite the fact that these 3-month phases occur only every 47 years, there is an unambiguous connection between the man and the 3 most important women in his life. Now remember, this is something that happens once every 47 years for about 3 months. And I'm going to list you 4 events relating to people in his life. And again, the whole purpose of this technique is to illustrate something that is completely unambiguous. Next slide, please. Okay, first I'm going to talk about McCartney's mother. Paul McCartney's mother, Mary, was born September 29, 1909 in Liverpool. Although we have no record of her time of birth, it is not required to determine that she was born with Mars retrograde in sidereal Pisces. Some of you might know the Beatles song, Let It Be, and that's a song that he wrote about his mother. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary calls to me. It was a time when the Beatles were breaking up and Paul was missing his mother, who had passed away. I'll get to that in just a moment. Mary McCartney was a nurse. And she was born, as I said, with Mars retrograde in Pisces. And over the course of the 47 years of her life, because she lived 47 years, not once in her life while she's alive was Mars retrograde in Pisces ever repeated until, next slide please, until 1956, at the age of 47, at the age of 47, she passed away of breast cancer on October 31st that year, and it was just 21 days after Mars had been retrograde in Pisces. It had gone into sidereal Aquarius, and it was going to move forward. So again, this is a very striking thing, because just in the context of this woman's life, she was born under the Mars retrograde phase, and the last months of her life were spent during the Mars retrograde phase in Pisces. A very rare occurrence. Next slide, please. McCartney's first wife, Linda McCartney, to whom he was married for 28 years, pretty much a complete Saturn cycle. Linda Eastman McCartney was born on September 24th, 1941 at 10 a.m. in New York City with natal Mars retrograde in Pisces. Like Paul's mother, she also died of breast cancer, although in this case not during any Mars retrograde phase. When she passed away on April 17th, 1998, the Sun was approaching conjunction to Mars in Aries. I don't have a slide for that, but we'll move along to the next slide, please. Jumping ahead another very long period of time, McCartney's youngest daughter, Beatrice, was born during his second marriage on October 28, 2003 at 8:45 p.m. in Liverpool. She came to life 3 days before the 47th anniversary of his mother's death. Mars was in sidereal Aquarius. Again, it had done that retrograde in that same phase, this very rare phase that only occurs every 47 years. She was born 31 days following its station, but still in the context of something that happens every 47 years, a month, 31 days is not a very big margin of error. On to my next slide, please. Oof, I forgot how scary that picture looks. Okay, this is Hillary Rodham Clinton. She's trying to become president once again. She was born with Mars sidereal Cancer on October 26, 1947, 8 p.m. in Chicago, probably 8 p.m. in Chicago, and this is part of my argument here. Whenever she has been asked her time of birth, Mrs. Clinton has always said 8 p.m. There is no record of her ever saying anything else. There is one astrologer who claims to have heard her say 8 a.m., but we cannot verify the source for that claim. Regardless, it is one of these controversial matters where the matter of whether a birth time is an AM or a PM birth can cause great confusion for an astrologer. But here I'm going to make a case for this 8 p.m. time, which Mrs. Clinton has always given. Next slide, please. Now, as I was saying earlier at the beginning, the Mars retrograde phase in Cancer is actually, in sidereal Cancer, is actually quite common. It occurs every 15 to 17 years. So, over the course of an adult lifetime, someone can experience 4 or 5, an average of 4 or 5 Mars retrogrades in any of those sidereal signs. Nonetheless, when people have very prominent angles or planets in one of those signs, that means every 15 to 17 years, that planet is going to be transited by this Mars retrograde. And what happens very, very, very frequently, this is a very reliable technique, is if you follow those retrogrades in that particular sign, it illustrates a sort of story, not unlike what I was doing with McCartney, but really just over the course of one person's life. And I'm just going to illustrate these 4 times in Hillary's life, and Mrs. Clinton's life, that Mars has gone retrograde from in sidereal Cancer. into sidereal Gemini. Number one, when she was 13 years old, at the time, Hillary Rodham was a 13-year-old Republican. She was just becoming politicized, as we often do around the age of 12, 13, we start to become politically aware. And the same was true for her. Now, this was the election in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And I keep calling her Mrs. Clinton, she's not Mrs. Clinton yet. Hillary Rodham was a supporter of Richard Nixon. And she lived in Chicago, and what she discovered on election night, November 8th, 1960 in Chicago, was that the Democrats, John F. Kennedy's people, with the help of mobsters, were stuffing ballots in Chicago to give the Democrats a victory. She discovered this on her own, but before she could report it, she saw on television Richard Nixon submitting to defeat to Kennedy. So this was for this 13-year-old girl who's just discovering politics and who we know with the benefit of hindsight is going to be a very important figure in politics. At the age of 13, she's learning this very important lesson about corruption, about the dirty politics, at an age when we usually get to keep our innocence just a little bit longer. Next slide, please. Okay, again, this is not ambiguous, like I said. I do not need to explain why, as Mars was going to go retrograde in sidereal Gemini, again that same area from sidereal Cancer to sidereal Gemini, she married Bill Clinton on the 11th of October, 1975, with Mars up there, just 25 days from making its retrograde station in sidereal Gemini. Next slide, please. 17 years later, this is not ambiguous, 17 years later, the next time Mars is going to go retrograde in that particular area, Bill Clinton is elected U.S. President on the 3rd of November, 1992. Self-explanatory, doesn't need an interpretation. 13 years old, she's getting political. 1975, she marries Bill Clinton, and then the next time that Mars retrograde goes there, he's elected president. Very, very basic, very simple. Next slide, please. This is the last time we had this retrograde. It wasn't too long ago. Hillary Clinton, and at this point she is Mrs. Clinton, she was considered a shoo-in in 2007 to win the Democratic nomination for president. And I remember this day very clearly. On the 3rd of January, 2008, Barack Obama, this senator from Illinois who was coming out of nowhere, suddenly won the Iowa caucus. This is when state by state in the United States, they choose their candidate. And Iowa is in the Midwest of the United States. This is a place where no one would ever expect them to elect a black man, very simply, in American history. And what happened on this day was everyone suddenly realized America was ready to elect a black man. And this is really the day that everyone realized this could happen. This could happen. And from here on, Obama gradually overtook Clinton in this very tough political contest. So again, it's not ambiguous. As with Paul McCartney, you can just take a couple of events using this technique, and suddenly you have something that really tells you something very fundamental and unambiguous about the life. Next slide, please. I'm going to move away from Western things, and I'm going to get a little closer to India here as I get closer and closer to India. I want to talk a little bit about one of this country's neighbors, not too far away, Iran, home of our distinguished guest, Mr. Khazini. Hello. He's suddenly moving into the front row. I think he wants to know what I'm going to say about his country. This is a political context. The nation of Iran, also known as Persia, has a striking relationship with the Mars retrograde transits of Mars in Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. I could also do the same work for Russia, but I've chosen Iran today because it's closer by. Next slide, please. This is going to be the same thing. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the rare Mars retrogrades in these particular sidereal signs, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. Number one, I'm going to go back to 1813. This was, ironically, war with Russia. Like I said, Russia and Iran, their history timelines seem to correspond very strongly to this particular rare pattern of the Mars retrograde. And of course, these two countries have a long history of being in contention. This is one of them. They fought a war, the First Persian-Russian War in 1813. The Russians defeated the Persians, and they took this big chunk of territory that you can see illustrated in the map. This is a territory we still hear about in the news all the time, Azerbaijan, Georgia. This used to be Persian territory, and from here on in, this would be Russian territory. Stalin was from Georgia, so this is very important. If Russia had never won this war, Stalin would have been more of a Persian than a Russian, but anyway, I won't get too caught up in that. The important thing is you can see Mars is in sidereal Capricorn, and it is 54 days from its following its retrograde in sidereal Aquarius to Capricorn. The point being, actually, I'll get to the point in a moment later on. Next slide, please. Okay, now we've jumped ahead to 1909. We're in the 20th century. Following a popular uprising, Persian ruler Muhammad Ali Shah sought refuge at Tehran's Russian embassy on July 17, 1909 at 8:30 a.m., 36 days prior to the Mars retrograde station in sidereal Pisces. He would flee the country 2 months later as Mars made its retrograde transit in Pisces. But here he was, in this case, running to the Russians to rescue him from his own people. Next slide, please. Now we're getting closer to history that we might recognize. 32 years later, Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, of the new Iran, of the nation of Iran, because it wasn't Iran back in the days of 1909. He's the first leader of the new nation of Iran, and he was forced to abdicate and flee in exile. That seems to happen a lot down there. On September 16th, 1941, leaving the throne to his son, and as you can see, transiting Mars was going retrograde from sidereal Aries into Pisces. Next slide, please. 30 years later, beginning October 12, 1971, the Shah of Iran, this is the son of the one who was deposed, hosted a huge celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. What a birthday. Not too many wrinkles. The event was controversial in Iran due to the fact that many political dissidents were imprisoned by the Shah in the hope of keeping protests to a minimum. But this served to deepen resentment towards the leader, and it was one of these big instigators towards the revolution that would happen in early 1979. Interestingly, when the Iranian Revolution happened 8 years later, the Sun and Mars would be conjunct in Capricorn, which is sort of the flip side, the shadow side, if you will, of the retrograde in Capricorn. So there's almost an echo, I think, of very much a relationship in time between the retrograde phase and the conjunction to the Sun phase. Next slide, please. Okay, Iran was involved in a very bloody war with neighboring Iraq for 8 years, finally ending with a ceasefire on August 20th, 1988, 6 days prior to its retrograde station in Pisces. This is known as one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. A few of Iran's more recent leaders, I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to just talk about some very recent leaders in Iranian history who all seem to have Mars in this very rare Mars retrograde phase that only happens every 32 to 47 years. Number one, this is Mir Hussein Mousavi, born the 29th of September, 1941. He was prime minister or president? But in the 80s he was prime minister, right? Yeah. He was prime minister in the 80s during the war that I just talked about. So think about this. While Iran was fighting a war that would end on the Mars direct station, the prime minister, the man leading that war, also had Mars in that very rare phase. It's an astonishing connection. Next slide, please. Okay, this is 3 presidents ago. This is Mohammad Khatami. Apparently you're not even allowed to say his name in Iran right now, right? You can't even say his name. But he was president back in the 90s. And he was born with Mars in a rare sign, not as rare as the others, but I'm including him in here. It's in sidereal Taurus. It's not as rare as the other ones I'm talking about, but in the context of everyone I'm putting together, I thought it was worth putting him in here, especially with his successor. Next slide, please. The second to last president, I think everyone remembers this guy. This is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He was born the 28th of October, 1956. And he was born with Mars This is the same week that Paul McCartney's mother died, remember? This is Mars post-retrograde. It had gone from sidereal Pisces into sidereal Aquarius. So again, another one of these Iranian leaders who's born in this rare Mars retrograde phase. Next slide, please. But most importantly, beyond prime ministers and presidents, it's the religious leader of the nation who has ultimate power in a place like Iran. And this is Ali Khamenei. He is the reigning Ayatollah, and he was born on the 17th of July, 1939, with Mars retrograde in sidereal Capricorn. Now, here's the thing about Mars retrograde in sidereal Capricorn. The last time it happened was 1971. That time I showed you when the Iranians had that big parade, the big celebration of the Persian Empire. What I didn't show you at the time was Mars, for that particular retrograde in 1971, was conjunct Rahu. And I'm going to get around to talking about 1971 and more local politics, and maybe you can already anticipate what I'm saying, because we know 1971 was not an easy year in this area. And with Mars retrograde conjunct, what happens with Mars retrograde is it stays in the same place for a long time, and it moves backward with Rahu. So it's not just a one-week kind of transit, it's the two of them moving together for a very, very long time. And that's what we had in 1971. But I'll get back to that in a minute. I just wanted to give you a little bit of foreshadowing with where I'm going with this. The next time Mars goes retrograde, let me just check my slide to make sure I know where I'm going with this. Yes, next slide, please. The next time Mars is going to go retrograde in Capricorn, the first time since 1971, is just 2 years away, the 27th of June, 2018. And this time, it's going to go retrograde with Ketu. It's like the flip side of 1971. It's whatever happens in the summer of 2018 with regard to Iran, and probably with regard to what happens close to here, is an echo of the summer of 1971. They're not the same events, not the same outcomes, but the same subjects come up, the same problems arise, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, of course you're all wondering, okay, Iran, that's very nice, Nick. Tell us about India, right? I mean, that's what we want to know. Let's talk a little bit about India and India's history with the cycle. 3 clicks, please. Okay. We had a very rare Mars retrograde in Capricorn with Rahu back June 17th, 1860. This is the last time we had this retrograde with Rahu in this particular sign. Now, this wasn't such a bad time for India, actually. This is a very good time. It was a violent time, but it was a violent time for the United States, who are just about to get into their civil war this very year. Why would that matter to India? Because Britain suddenly cannot export cotton from the United States, and they turn to their colony of India to begin producing cotton. This is the event. If the United States does not get into the war, one of the most important industries, a foundation industry for India, will not be instigated by Britain. So this was obviously a very sort of important foundation. It's a seed that lasts to this day. 3 more clicks, please. Another thing to say about 1860 is that the Indian, before I get to 1892, in 1860, our magistrate might recognize that the Indian Penal Code was introduced in 1860, just after this Mars retrograde. And this is a penal code that still exists today in India and in Pakistan. This is still the foundation of Indian law and Pakistani law that comes out of this particular period. So I'm finding these astonishing foundations of Indian society, be it in industry or in law, that derive from this very rare Mars retrograde cycle. And I find this especially interesting because in 1892, we had the British passed one of their Indian Councils Act, where they basically established a parliament in Indian society. And then 3 more clicks, please. In 1909, I just want to remember the particular, the 2 men who did this. The Minto-Morley reforms. This was another Indian Councils Act. So I find this very striking. You can see these Mars retrogrades in either Capricorn or Pisces. We know they're very, very rare. They don't occur very often. But all this parliamentary establishment, all this creation of law and political growth that corresponds to this very rare interval, I find very, very striking. Okay, 3 more clicks, please. And this takes us to 1971, what I've been hinting at. Now, 1971 was very turbulent. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure a lot of people in the room do know. In March of 1971, East Pakistan, which is pretty much a place just down the road that we today call Bangladesh, but in March of 1971, they were still called East Pakistan, and they wanted more, they had more population, but they were poorer. They had just won, their candidate had just won a Pakistani election, but West Pakistan was reluctant to let that candidate take office. And things started to brew in March of 1971. The West Pakistani army went into East Pakistan and started committing atrocities, started murdering people, political dissidents, students, people like that. To make matters worse, in the summer, during the actual Mars retrograde with Rahu, there were terrible floods and famines. And right here in Kolkata, I believe there were scores of refugees from this massacre that was going on. By the end of the year, in December, the Indian Army would go into East Pakistan, defeat West Pakistan in a few weeks, and that would help create the nation of Bangladesh as we know it today. So, while the beginning of that conflict and the ending of that conflict did not coincide with this Mars retrograde per se, they bookended it in this very elegant way, and there was so much going on. And certainly in the summer, the murders were happening, the famine was happening, the flood was happening. This was really, really tormenting, really horrible stuff to go through, I can imagine. Next slide, please. Okay, now I just want to talk a little bit about the combination of Mars retrogrades with a particular planet. That would be Saturn. Now, in both of our astrologies, a combination of Mars and Saturn gives one cause for concern. It's not always a bad thing, but it is at least, it brings an astrologer's attention as to what could possibly come. Now, what happens is, next Mars retrograde that we're going to have, April 17th of this year, is going to happen in sidereal Scorpio, very, very close to Saturn in Scorpio. Mars retrogrades in the same sign as Scorpio are quite rare, even more rare than just the actual retrograde itself. Let me just get to my notes here. I think I need to... Yep. Okay, yes, I know where I'm going with this. It occurs at approximately 30 to 32-year intervals. You'll get a Mars retrograde with Saturn. And in Indian history, there have been some incidents that have corresponded to this rare combination that I think you would want me to tell you about. Next slide, please. Number one, on the 30th of January, 1948, at 5:10 p.m. in Delhi, Mahatma Gandhi was murdered. Mars was retrograde. It was not yet in the same sign with Saturn, but it was headed there. By the end of its retrograde, it would be in Cancer with Saturn. And by the end of that retrograde, with Mars retrograde in Cancer with Saturn, we would have the beginning of the first war between the new nation of India and the new nation of Pakistan over this territory of Kashmir, which of course is still a problem for us today, but this is the emergence of this very difficult schism between neighbors and former countrymen. Next slide, please. The very last time we had a Mars retrograde in the same sign as Saturn, it was in 1984. You can see they were very close together in sidereal Libra, and there was this very unfortunate incident on the 4th of June 1984 at 4:40 in Amritsar. There was this Sikh extremist, as they called him, and he had a group of followers, and they were basically holed up in the Golden Temple, this very, very important spiritual religious center for the Sikh people. And the Indian Army basically went in there with the intention of merely arresting him, but things got out of hand. There was quite a lot of violence and quite a bit of resentment, leading to the fact that by the following October, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was murdered by her Sikh bodyguard really for this very incident. So even though her murder was delayed, it's directly related to the event that happened on this particular night. And the subsequent struggle between Hindu India and the Sikh people at this period would continue to unfold with every successive Mars retrograde phase. In 1986, there was another operation to go after Sikh extremists that happened at the next Mars retrograde that followed this one, and then again in 1988. So there was a lot about this division that was very tough in this country at the time that has to do with this particular Mars cycle. Now, what does this all mean? Next slide, please. This spring's conjunction of Mars retrograde and Saturn in sidereal Scorpio appears to suggest an aggressive use of force in an attempt to exert control over people or circumstances. Whether this means the use of government power in order to suppress the action of citizens, or perhaps just to manage some type of environmental crisis, is difficult to say. Obviously, I wish peace for India and its neighbors. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my astrological passion with you. Namaste. Thank you.
We should give him a big hand first, and then I will speak. Where he has gone? He has come here. He has done a research on historically, chronologically, what happened when Mars was retrograde. He has also touched the point when it is in conjunction state with other Catholic culture. But he has proved his point. I would just say, whenever it is be Jupiter, the loss of man would be on a gradual scale. So far other aspects are concerned, Martian traits would be benefiting the person. I have a very short say about debilitation, combustion you have said. Combustion, debilitation and retrogression. Apart from retrogression, there is one thing which is known as duritans. I will let you know afterwards, sometime when I get time. These 4 points give or reduce gives in 4 ways. First way is the relation is not born. Second thing is, in case relation is born, he goes abroad, so he is not readily available. In case he is in India, then he lives apart and does not allow his brother or sister the happiness of family. In 4th case, there is some incident which is likely to harm. But I must thank him the way he has drawn our attention to the coming date. I would examine it and send you a note on this aspect. Because it is very important and timely. Congratulations to him and wish you long life and give it. Not a long life to you alone. Not alone, but to your friend, lighting every time. Thank you.
Now request Ms. Anusha to please come forward and explain Mr. Nick's subject, that was seemingly random crisis, the Mars retrograde phase in history.
नमस्कार, मैं मिस्टर निक डैगन बेस्ड का विषय मार्स रेट्रोग्रेड को हिंदी में संक्षिप्त में वर्णन करूंगी। शुरू करने से पहले मैं ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि हालांकि एक पश्चिमी ज्योतिषी हूँ, जो मैं अपने काम में उष्णकटिबंध या ट्रॉपिकल ज्योतिष चक्र का इस्तेमाल करता हूँ, जो मैं आज यहाँ पेश करूंगा, जो किसी एक ज्योतिष चक्र के अंतर्गत नहीं है। वो वास्तव में एक प्राचीन कालीन बेबीलोनियन रीति के ज्योतिष विचार हैं, जो सूर्य के नाते में ग्रहों का सिनोडिक चक्र है। इसमें ग्रहों का परिभ्रमण द्वारा बनाए गए ऐतिहासिक नक्शा उभर आते हैं। हालांकि मैं एक कंसल्टेंट या सलाहकारी ज्योतिष हूँ, मेरी प्राथमिक ज्योतिषी जोश इतिहास चर्चा है। चाहे वो व्यक्तिगत या सामूहिक इतिहास हो, राजनीति और कला दोनों के क्षेत्र में। ज्योतिष शास्त्र सही में एक कैलेंडर प्रणाली है जो समय में हर पल के लिए एक अनोखा मूल्य प्रदान करता है। पल पल, दिन के दिन, साल दर साल, शतक से शतक, सहस्त्र शताब्दी से सहस्त्र शताब्दी, कोई भी ग्रह का सजावट दोबारा पूरी तरह से एक नहीं होता। हर ग्रह का अपना लय होता है जो राशि चक्र के 12 चिन्ह के पारगमन के लिए एक विशिष्ट समय लेता है। मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड या मंगल प्रतिगामी क्या है? जब ग्रह अपनी परिधि में घूमते घूमते पृथ्वी के पास आता है, उसकी गति धीमी हो जाती है एवं स्थिर हो जाती है। फिर 3 महीनों तक वो पीछे की तरफ जाता है, फिर उसकी गति धीमी होती है एवं स्थिर होती है, फिर वो आगे की तरफ बढ़ना शुरू करता है। इस घटना के परिणाम स्वरूप मंगल अपनी उसी ग्रह में रहता है करीब 6 महीने तक या अपने एक ही राशि में। इस घटना के परिणाम स्वरूप मंगल अपनी स्पष्ट गति बदलता है एवं इस प्रतिगामी का फल ज्योतिष की दुनिया में प्रभाव देता है। मंगल प्रति 24 महीनों में एक बार रेट्रोग्रेड में जाता है। रेट्रोग्रेड लगभग 3 महीने रहता है। हर 15 से 17 साल में मंगल का लगातार मिथुन, कर्क और सिंह के निरायन ग्रहों से रेट्रोग्रेड पारगमन होता है। अन्य राशियों में रेट्रोग्रेड काफी देर से आते हैं, जैसे धनु, मकर, कुंभ और मीन राशियों में। इनमें 47 सालों तक का अंतराल होता है। पॉल मैककार्टनी, बीटल्स के एक पूर्व सदस्य पॉल मैककार्टनी का कुंभ मीन राशि के मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड के साथ एक गहरा संबंध है। पॉल मैककार्टनी का जन्म 18 जून 1942 में दोपहर के 2 बजे लिवरपूल, इंग्लैंड में हुआ था। उनके जन्म चार्ट यानी नेटल चार्ट में कर्क में मंगल का अवस्थान है और निकटतम पहलू शनि का एक सेक्सटाइल वृष के घर में है। हालांकि मंगल उनकी किसी भी राशि चक्र में शासक ग्रह नहीं है, पर उनके चार्ट के प्रतिगामी चक्र यानी रेट्रोग्रेड साइकिल उनके जीवन की कई महत्वपूर्ण घटनाओं और लोगों के साथ ताल्लुक रखता है। इस चक्र के बावजूद ये 3 महीने के चरणों में 47 साल में एक बार आता है, फिर भी इसका उनके जीवन का 3 सबसे महत्वपूर्ण महिलाओं के साथ एक गहरा संबंध है। मैककार्टनी की मां मैरी का जन्म 29 सितंबर 1909 में लिवरपूल शहर में हुआ। हालांकि उनके जन्म समय का कोई अभिलेख नहीं है और इसकी जरूरत भी नहीं है ये पता करने के लिए कि उनका जन्म मीन राशि के मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड में हुआ था। मैरी दूसरे मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड तक नहीं जी पाई क्योंकि 47 साल की उम्र में ब्रेस्ट कैंसर से उनकी मृत्यु हो गई। जिस साल के 21 अक्टूबर में उनकी मृत्यु हुई, मंगल का कुंभ राशि में अवस्थान उससे 21 दिन बाद हो गई। उनके जीवन के अंतिम 3 महीनों में मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड में मीन से कुंभ तक जा चुका था। मैककार्टनी की 29 सालों के वैवाहिक जीवन में उनकी पत्नी लिंडा ईस्टमैन मैककार्टनी का जन्म 24 सितंबर 1941 सुबह के 10 बजे न्यूयॉर्क शहर में हुआ था। उनके जन्म चार्ट मंगल मीन राशि में रेट्रोग्रेड में था। मैककार्टनी के मां की तरह उनकी पत्नी को भी ब्रेस्ट कैंसर हुआ था और मृत्यु की वजह भी वही था, लेकिन उस वक्त मंगल का कोई रेट्रोग्रेड नहीं था। 17 अप्रैल 1988 में जब उनकी मृत्यु हुई तब सूर्य मंगल में मेष राशि के साथ संयुक्त था। मैककार्टनी की बेटी बेट्रिक्स पैदा हुई उनकी द्वितीय विवाह के समय 28 अक्टूबर 2003 शाम के 8:45 पर लिवरपूल शहर में अपनी मां के 47वीं मृत्यु वार्षिकी से 3 दिन पहले दुनिया में आई। मंगल का अवस्थान उस समय कुंभ राशि में था। अब मैं व्यक्तिगत से राजनीति की तरफ जाना चाहूंगा। ईरान या पर्शिया का मंगल का मकर, कुंभ और मीन राशियों के रेट्रोग्रेड पारगमन से गहरा संबंध है। रशिया से पराजित होने के बाद ईरान ने जॉर्जिया और अजरबैजान प्रदेशों को 24 अक्टूबर 1813 में ट्रीटी ऑफ गुलिस्तान के माध्यम से रशिया को दे दिया था। उस समय मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड पारगमन में कुंभ से मकर की ओर प्रस्थान कर रहा था। विद्रोह के बाद पर्शियन शासक मोहम्मद अली शाह तेहरान के रशियन एम्बेसी में 17 जुलाई 1909 में सुबह के 8:30 बजे शरण लिए थे। मेष राशि में मंगल का रेट्रोग्रेड होने से 36 दिन पहले 2 महीने बाद उन्होंने अपना देश छोड़ा, जब मंगल का रेट्रोग्रेड परिभ्रमण मेष राशि से मीन राशि की ओर था। 32 साल बाद ईरान के शासक रेजा शाह पहलवी फिर से सत्ता छोड़कर देश से जाने के लिए मजबूर हो गए। 16 सितंबर 1941 को एक बार फिर मंगल का रेट्रोग्रेड मेष से मीन तक का था। ईरान के कुछ अभी के शासकों के जन्म चक्र में मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड में है, जैसे कि मीर हुसैन मौसवी और महमूद अहमदीनेजाद। अब हम भारत के बारे में देखेंगे। 1860 में जब अमेरिका में सिविल वॉर का शुरुआत हुआ था, उस समय मंगल मकर से धनु की ओर रेट्रोग्रेड में था। अमेरिका में रुई का रफ्तानी बंद होने की वजह से अंग्रेज भारत को रुई उत्पादन क्षेत्र में लाया, जिसके फलस्वरूप भारत इतना बड़ा रुई उत्पादन उद्योग में परिणत हुआ। 1982 और 1909 के मंगल रेट्रोग्रेड के दौरान भारत में संसदीय प्रथा की स्थापना हुई। सबसे मुख्य भारत के लिए 1971 का मंगल का रेट्रोग्रेड था, जब पश्चिम एवं